This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Man of Steel released 12 years ago, and it is widely known as the controversial start to the DC Extended Universe. With James Gunn's Superman just around the corner, it's time to look back at the last Superman film and see what went wrong. Despite this film and the wider Snyderverse having such a strong niche following, why did Man of Steel fail to kickstart any excitement in the DCEU in the way that Iron Man did for the MCU? In order to truly understand the decisions made in Man of Steel, we need to travel back in time to 2008 and look at the production of the film. 2008 was a really interesting time for the DC universe. The anticipated sequel to Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, was released in July. The film turned out to be a massive success for Warner Brothers. Not only was it a critical success, but the film also managed to cross $1 billion at the box office. This was the 7th film in Hollywood history to reach the $1 billion mark. With DC back in the spotlight, Warner Brothers began discussions around their other biggest property, and that was Superman. Interestingly enough, Superman had a movie in 2006, Superman Returns. The movie was by no means a critical failure, but it certainly disappointed at the box office. On a budget of $200 million, the movie only grossed $391 million. Keep in mind, a $200 million budget may seem somewhat standard in today's Hollywood, but it was not standard in a mid-2000s Hollywood. Warner Brothers wanted to have their new Superman movie follow in the footsteps of Nolan's Batman movies, a darker and more realistic take on the character. Also, the writers they brought in said Warner Brothers could treat Superman Returns like Marvel treated Ang Lee's Hulk. In 2003, there was a Hulk movie, and in 2008, The Incredible Hulk was a full-on reboot for the character. So in August of 2008, Warner Brothers came out and said that the next Superman movie would not be a sequel to Superman Returns, but rather a reboot of the franchise. Warner Brothers studio exec Jeff Robinov had this to say: Superman Returns didn't quite work as a film in the way that we wanted it to. It didn't position the character the way he needed to be positioned. Had Superman worked in 2006, we would have had a movie for Christmas of this year or in 2009. Now the plan is to just reintroduce Superman. There were a lot of ideas thrown around for how to reboot Superman. Writer Grant Morrison had an idea of an adaptation of his comic book All-Star Superman. Writer Mark Waid pitched an adaptation of Superman Birthright. Director Matthew Vaughn pitched an epic 8-hour trilogy akin to the Lord of the Rings films, but ultimately none of these ideas went far with Warner Brothers. A year later, in August of 2009, turmoil struck Warner Brothers. The estate of Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Superman, took Warner Brothers to court and recaptured 50% of the rights to Superman. Variety stated that the reason this case was so important was because if they did not begin production on a Superman film by 2011, then the Siegel estate would have been able to sue for lost revenue on an unproduced film. This meant that the Superman reboot was sent into production right away to meet the 2011 deadline. During this time, discussions were had between Warner Brothers, director Christopher Nolan, and writer David S. Goyer about the next and final Dark Knight film. During these discussions, they also discussed approaching the Superman reboot. Because of the success of The Dark Knight, they wanted to take a modern approach to Superman, making the films as realistic as possible, just like Nolan's Batman films. Eventually, Goyer presented Nolan with an idea, and Nolan had this to say. He basically told me, I have this thought about how you would approach Superman. I immediately got it, loved it, and thought, that is the way of approaching the story I've never seen before that makes it incredibly exciting. Because Nolan was directing Inception at the time and would begin working on The Dark Knight Rises shortly afterwards, he would not be directing the Superman reboot, now dubbed Man of Steel. But Nolan would be serving as an executive producer. As a result, many theorized about if Man of Steel would connect with Nolan's Batman trilogy, but this was quickly debunked by Nolan, with him emphasizing there would be no connection. So it came time for the director search, and of course a bunch of people were considered for the role. Guillermo del Toro was officially offered the director chair, but he turned it down due to prior engagements. Other directors considered for the position were Darren Aronofsky, Duncan Jones, Jonathan Liebsman, Matt Reeves, Tony Scott, and funny enough, Ben Affleck. But in October of 2010, Zack Snyder was officially hired to direct Man of Steel. Zack Snyder at the time was most well known for his films Dawn of the Dead, 300, and Watchmen. He was also working on his newest film, Sucker Punch. So with Zack Snyder officially hired, the casting process began. Many actors were considered for the role of Superman, but as we know, the role ended up going to Henry Cavill. Many actresses were considered for the role of Lois Lane, but the role went to Amy Adams, who actually had auditioned for the role in the past, including for Superman Returns. Michael Shannon, Kevin Costner, Diane Lane, Lawrence Fishburne, and Russell Crowe would iron out the cast. Principal photography began on August 1st, 2011. Filming would last roughly 6 months and concluded in February of 2012. 16 months later, on June 10th, 2013, Man of Steel would be released in theaters. Unlike most of the future films in the DCEU, Man of Steel would have a relatively clean production. Actors over the years have consistently said they love working with Zack Snyder, and Man of Steel is no exception. So how did the movie turn out? Well, let's dive deep into the story of Man of Steel. But before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 14.8% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. There's a lot of aspects of this film that I want to cover, so I'm going to begin by discussing the themes of this movie and how well or poorly Zack conveyed them. Say what you will about Zack Snyder, but he is a filmmaker that finds it important to convey a message through his stories. Zack's films all exude authorship, and that is probably why he has such a devoted fan base. If I had to summarize the theme of Man of Steel into one sentence, it would be the importance of being able to choose your own path in life. That people must have the freedom to chase their own dreams and not what was predetermined. Clark didn't need to just be Clark or Cal. As Jor-El said, he could be the best of both worlds, represent the ideals that he wants from what both his fathers taught him. Clark chose to help people. He chose to keep his identity a secret, but above all else, he chose to be Superman. If you watched most of Zack Snyder's films, you would know that his beliefs in personal agency is paramount, and pretty much the whole backstory to Krypton symbolizes that. Krypton had turned to artificial births for centuries, and that's when they began to lose their way. It was the natural birth of Kal-El that symbolized a future where Kal could be anything he wanted. What should he do? How should he act? Jonathan Kent, coincidentally enough, shared the same philosophy as Jor-El. Every time Jonathan Kent has a conversation with Clark, it's always about Clark choosing what man he wants to be. The biggest reason he asked Clark to not save him from the tornado is because he wanted Clark to be able to choose when he wants to reveal himself to the world, not be forced to do so to save his dad. Zod, on the other hand, is supposed to represent the opposite of that. Zod from birth was determined he would be a soldier and that he must always protect Krypton. This purpose in life, as he calls it, is what leads him down the path to attempted genocide against the human race. So how well does Zack convey these themes through Man of Steel? Well, I'm a bit mixed on that. First and foremost, I do love the message of personal agency. It's just a belief I fundamentally agree with, so I do appreciate the core message. But the execution of this idea in Man of Steel I find to be a bit sloppy. So the first half of this movie is pretty much all about Clark finding out who he is and where he comes from. We get flashbacks to Clark when he was younger, and the hologram of Jor-El tells him what his origins were and how he ended up on Earth. Upon his quest of self-discovery, Clark accidentally reveals to Zod where he is, and this is when Zod announces to the world that they have 24 hours to turn over Clark or they will suffer the consequences. Clark then proceeds to talk to his mom and a pastor about what he should do, and thus he inevitably agrees to help and turn himself in. This moment, I feel, is supposed to symbolize Clark making that choice. All movie he had spent finding out what kind of man he wants to be, and here he is finally making that choice to reveal himself. He is ready. My issue here is that given the position he is put in, Clark is given the illusion of choice. His options are either to reveal who he is and turn himself in, or let Zod destroy the world. When characters are told they have to make a choice, and one of the choices is to let billions of people die, including your loved loved ones, that's not a real choice. We all know Clark is a decent human being in that he would never choose to be selfish and hide himself away when the whole world was at stake. The whole reason Jonathan Kent sacrificed himself was, as I said earlier, so Clark could choose to reveal himself when he was ready. But both the tornado and Zod narratively represent the same thing. Both are external forces outside of Clark's control that are essentially forcing him to either reveal himself or sacrifice loved ones. The first time he agrees to sacrifice his father, and the second time he chooses to reveal himself. So to me at least, this isn't really a moment where Clark was given a true choice. But moving on, this leads us into our final battle. Zod wants to terraform Earth so Krypton can live again, and Clark wants to stop him. The best final battles where the hero and the villain fight usually have two types of stakes, the internal and the external stakes. External stakes are what's plot related. In this case, it's the fate of the Earth. The internal stakes are usually the philosophies or themes of the movie. Clark represents freedom of choice and Zod represents predetermination. So their final battle is not just about saving the world, it's also about whose philosophy will win. On paper, this sounds great, but not in execution so much. I feel Clark and Zod are more so conduits of their philosophies rather than actually holding those philosophies. Here's what I mean by that. I don't know if freedom of choice is a fundamental part of Clark's belief system. We know it was for both his fathers, but I'm not sure about Clark. When he's fighting Zod, I don't know if it ever crosses his mind that he needs to win this battle to show the world that freedom of choice is important. On the other side of the coin, I don't know if Zod fundamentally believes in predetermination. When Jor-El tells Zod in the beginning of the movie that he had a natural birth, Zod says that's heresy, but besides that, I don't know if Zod is fighting for his philosophy. The whole reason he is trying to terraform Earth is to save Krypton, not so much to continue on his philosophies. Like if I told Zod that he could recreate Krypton but life on Krypton would be free, I think he would take it. I guess you could argue that Zod wanting to bring back Krypton means he also wants to bring back all of Krypton's ideas, including the ideas of predetermination, and listen, I would give you that point, but I'm not sure if it's as conveyed as well in the film. At the end of the day, saving Krypton is far more important to Zod than predetermination. So when Zod and Clark are fighting each other, both are solely concerned about the fate of the Earth, not the moral battle of predetermination. But as I said before, it is obvious that they are both conduits of this philosophy. Clark is able to be here because of his freedom of choice, and Zod is able to be here because of his predetermined life. So while both characters may or may not hold a strong philosophical belief, they are representing that idea. Let me compare this to maybe the best DC movie ever made, The Dark Knight. When you watch that movie and you see the Joker and Batman talk to each other, you know they are fighting a philosophical battle. The Joker fundamentally believes that you can turn anyone into a monster. That is the whole reason he is going after Harvey Dent. Batman, on the other hand, fundamentally believes in the good in people. The reason he never kills is because he believes that all people can be good. The reason Batman wins this philosophical battle at the end is because he sacrificed himself and his reputation so the image of Harvey Dent can remain good. People in Gotham believe in good after the death of Harvey, and the Joker lost because of that. Did Clark and the humans win the Battle of Metropolis because they believe in freedom? No. They just had a really good plan to destroy the world engine and Clark was able to win a fist fight. If your final battle is supposed to be subtle commentary about the themes of your movie, it's important that the reason your heroes win the battle is because of his or her belief system. And I can't say that is the case in Man of Steel. I guess you could argue that Clark could have turned himself into Zod and not revealed himself to the world. Clark didn't have to go to the US military and try and establish goodwill with them, and ultimately Clark doesn't win at the end without the military's plan to destroy the world engine. But again, I don't know if Clark did that because he believes in freedom of choice. He did it because he's a good person. So those are my thoughts on the themes of this movie. I really like the themes and I'm grateful Zack wanted to explore them in Man of Steel, but I don't think he conveyed the philosophical battle in the most elegant way. So moving on from that, I want to talk about the structure of this film, because that's another big critique people have of this movie. We have the prologue of the movie, which is everything on Krypton, and then we spend an hour developing Clark as a character, and then Zod shows up and we have a final battle. I don't hate this story structure. The opening sequence on Krypton I quite love. Everything that happened here could have been summarized in an exposition scene. In fact, that does happen when Clark is told by his father what happened to Krypton, but storytelling is more than just being told what happened. It's paramount that we see the fall of Krypton, so the lore is better conveyed to the audience. So the opening sequence I quite love. loved. The second part I won't criticize too much. Usually it's important that your story advances the plot and the character development at the same time. Man of Steel spent pretty much its entire second act developing the characters and not the plot. I would choose an hour of character development over an hour of plot development any day of the week. I just wish Snyder kinda did both here. But either way, I do love a lot of the character development. The scenes with Clark as a kid I think really work. It allows us to see how Clark grew up to the person we see in the present, and it also shows us the impact his father had on him. So again, I quite liked the character development. Where my frustrations start to kick in is with how the plot started to unfold. A lot of what advances the plot is based on things that happen by accident. The reason Clark was able to find the Kryptonian ship was because he happened to overhear some military people talking about it. I found that to be a lazy way to advance the plot. Remember when Lois spent a long time figuring out who Clark was? She talked to like a dozen different witnesses, and the combination of all that information led her to finding Clark. How lazy would it have been if Lois just sat down at an IHOP one day and happened to overhear that one guy from Clark's childhood mention the miracle boy who saved him, and that was how Lois found Clark? That's called being lazy. But because Lois made an active attempt to find Clark, not only does it feel more organic, but it reveals more about her character to us. The story would have been much better off if Clark had spent weeks or months trying to find any information about his past, and then after talking to dozens of people, that led him to these military men who spoke about the ship under the ice. Or maybe it led him to a source who had information about the ship. It's always better when the plot advances through characters' actions instead of conveniences. The same could be said for how Zod was able to find Clark. The only reason Zod found Clark was because Clark accidentally set off a distress beacon when he entered the ship. Imagine how much more interesting it would have been if Clark was on the ship and he intentionally chose to set off a distress beacon to see if other Kryptonians were out there. This way, Clark's drive to find his purpose led him to Zod's arrival, and then there would be some consequences to Clark's decisions. This would be a perfect way for Zack to tie in a message saying there are always consequences to freedom of choice, but in the end, it's worth it. Another example where convenience advanced the plot is with Zod's whole plan. He wants to terraform Earth to make a new Krypton, which makes sense, but why did he need to terraform Earth specifically? If Clark went to Zod and was like, I'll give you the codex as long as we terraform Mars instead, what would Zod say? When rewatching this movie, I went in specifically to see if Zod gave any reason why he had to terraform Earth. You could argue that's a bit nitpicky, and fair enough, but in my opinion, if a major plot hole could be explained in a single line of dialogue or two, it's always worth criticizing the hole in the first place. What if Zod was like, we need to terraform Earth because Earth has water and it has proven it can already sustain life? That's good enough of a reason for me, but I guess Zack wasn't thinking about that. Now, the last convenience in the plot I want to cover, and this is the one that bothered me the most, is Lois being on Zod's ship. The whole reason the humans were able to win this battle was because Jor-El was able to tell Lois about the hyperdrives that could form a black hole. But why was Lois on Zod's ship in the first place? When Clark turns himself in, one of the Kryptonian women says Zod wants Lois too, but we're never told why. How they even know of Lois makes no sense to me. Once Lois is on Zod's ship, she doesn't do anything. She just stands there and then is thrown into a jail cell. What if the Kryptonians threw Clark in a cell while they were analyzing his blood? During that time, he uses the key things and Jor-El tells Clark the stuff about the hyperdrives. That makes more sense to me. I feel Zack wanted Lois to be the one to talk to Jor-El solely so they can make her a more relevant part of the story, but in my mind it feels like a major convenience that drove the plot forward. So those are my thoughts on the structure of this movie. I really like the opening sequence and the character development, but the way the plot progressed felt lazy oftentimes. Moving on, I want to spend some time discussing another major topic when it comes to not only this movie, but Zack's movies as a whole, and that's his understanding of the characters. Does Zack Snyder understand Superman? A lot of people criticized Man of Steel for not properly depicting Superman. I've heard so many people saying Superman is supposed to be the symbol of hope that prioritizes saving human life above anything else, and that the mass destruction in Man of Steel and Clark's seemingly reluctance to stop it was a problem. I'm not gonna sit here and act like I'm an expert on Superman lore. I'm not. But it appears to me that Zack was trying to employ a trope with his DC films that have become more common in the decades since Man of Steel. That trope involves telling a story of a pre-existing character that that has a very clear defined personality and beliefs, then what the writers do is tell the story of how this person becomes the character that everyone knows and loves. When audiences criticize said character for not being depicted properly, the argument is that this person has not yet become the evolved version of the character. So in Man of Steel, the argument is that Superman is going on an arc to become this Superman everyone knows and loves from the Christopher Reeves days, that the events on Metropolis are something that is going to shape Clark into the Superman everyone loves. I'm not sure how I feel about this trope, but I think I like it. I greatly respect the decision Zack made to make sure his Superman film was different from what came before. So say what you will about Man of Steel, but it was a new take on the character, and I will always respect Zack for that. Now going back to this arc that Clark is on, I see where Zack was coming from, but I think there could have been some ways to make this more clear. One of my larger issues with Man of Steel was the lack of an epilogue. After Clark kills Zod, there are only 2 scenes left in the movie. One is of Clark telling the US military he won't let them track him, and the other is of Clark telling his mom that he will work for the Daily Planet along with a brief look at his first day. I have no issues with either of these scenes per se. What I do have an issue with is the lack of a proper resolution to the battle we just witnessed. These people on the Daily Planet almost died. We saw one of them trapped under rubble, and for a quick moment they kinda accepted that they were gonna die. We then see them briefly looking upon the destruction caused by the world engine, and then the next time we see them after that, they're at work talking about going to a basketball game. I get time could have passed, but narratively it feels weird that there was no acknowledgement of what they had just gone through. Now the reason I bring this up is because I think Clark should have had a scene of reflection. The Battle of Metropolis ends with Clark snapping Zod's neck. This moment was incredibly divisive amongst fans, saying Superman would never do this. After he snaps Zod's neck, we get this really powerful scream from Clark, clearly showing the pain that this caused him. That was a great moment, but afterwards we never get a moment where Clark reflects on killing Zod or all the damage that was just caused. And this extends into BVS as well. I think a major reason critics of this movie say Clark doesn't care about saving the innocent people is because we never see a visible reaction from Clark about all the damage that was done. In the case of snapping Zod's neck, imagine if there was a scene where Clark was talking to Lois and he was clearly haunted by killing Zod. He felt it was one of those things that he had to do, but he hated doing it, and then he tells Lois he will never do it again. I think critics would be more accepting of Clark snapping someone's neck if it was a moment that sparked a clear change in him, but it doesn't come across that way as the film currently stands. So when it comes to the destruction of Metropolis, imagine if there was a scene where Clark looks upon all the destruction that was caused and was visibly upset by this. We, the audience, know that wasn't Clark's fault by any means, but Clark would still blame himself and vow to do better next time. Maybe he holds a press conference where he takes responsibility for a lot of the destruction and pledges himself to help clean up the destruction. I don't believe a lot of critics have an issue with Clark's actions in the film. I think the issue stems from Clark's seemingly indifference towards his actions. In storytelling, actions are powerful, but reactions are arguably more powerful. So moments where Clark reflects and reacts to the events of the battle, I feel would have done a lot to further Zack's vision of this character. Let me know what you guys think of those changes. So is Zack Snyder's vision of Superman in line with the Superman everyone knows and loves? I'll let you guys decide. All I know is that Zack did have a clear arc in mind where Superman would inevitably become that popular version of Superman. Man of Steel is a fine movie. There's a lot to love and there's a lot to dislike, but we can all agree it's not as divisive as its sequel. So does a fine movie mean it was a failure? I'll let you guys decide. Let's check out the reception and legacy of the film and see what we can learn from it. Now, before we wrap up the video, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform for anyone who wants to stand out online or start a business. Whether you're a content creator like me or someone who wishes to start their own movie blog, Squarespace is perfect for you. If you sign up today, you can use Blueprint AI to get a fully custom website in just a few steps. Squarespace also offers a complete library of professionally designed and award-winning website templates, so you can use it to build your own beautiful page that will capture your audience in a way that only you can. If you're looking to build your own store because you're passionate about a product you wish to sell or have a wonderful idea, you can use Squarespace Payments to manage all your earnings in one place. You can set a variety of different prices, tiers, and paywalls, all of that. Pretty much anything that will give your customers their best value. If you're a YouTuber and you wish to upload special behind-the-scenes videos or extended videos, you can do that as well. Create your own Squarespace domain with no hidden fees or add-ons required. Don't wait. Invest in your dream domain today. Head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/thegoldman to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Again, that's squarespace.com/thegoldman to save 10% off your first purchase. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Man of Steel scored a 57% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 75% audience score. Of the 16 DCEU movies, it is ranked 10th. On IMDb, the movie scored a 7.1 out of 10. And of the 16 movies, IMDb has Man of Steel ranked 4th out of the 16 movies. So quite the discrepancy between Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb. Man of Steel grossed $670 million at the box office, making it the 5th highest grossing movie of the DCEU. Now, you may think that given these numbers, calling Man of Steel a failure is a little too harsh. Yeah, it doesn't have the best Rotten Tomatoes score, but the movie did pretty good at the box office, and overall fans seem to have enjoyed the movie, but I think this is why Warner Brothers probably wasn't happy with Man of Steel. It turned out to be just fine. People kind of enjoyed it and moved on. Remember what I said in the beginning of the video when talking about the production. A big reason this movie went into production was because of the success of the Nolan Batman trilogy. The second two Dark Knight films both crossed $1 billion. Warner Brothers also decided to reboot Superman after Superman Returns because that movie did just fine. Now, Man of Steel did way better than Superman Returns. It grossed $280 million more, but I think the movie didn't live up to expectations. Warner Brothers saw what Marvel was becoming and they wanted to strike big, but they failed to do that. Again, Man of Steel did just fine. I think a big problem with Man of Steel and the subsequent DCEU was that the universe never got off on the right foot. If you noticed during my discussion of the production of the film, it was never mentioned once that the Superman reboot was supposed to be the start of a cinematic universe. It wasn't written that way, it wasn't marketed that way. Man of Steel was a self-contained story. But what happened between the announcement of Man of Steel and its release? The Avengers came out in 2012. So right after Man of Steel, Warner Brothers wanted to rush a cinematic universe, and we ended up getting Batman v Superman. While I will always attest that BVS by far holds the biggest share of the blame for the failure of the DCEU, it did all start from Man of Steel. If Man of Steel did a better job establishing and developing the character of Clark Kent, does BVS become a better film? Maybe. Superman ended up dying in that movie, and people didn't seem to care enough to see his return in the Justice League movie, because that movie made even less money than Man of Steel. I think people in large part never got interested in this interpretation of the character. Of course, there are the Snyder fans that love these movies, but the wider fans don't. When Superman came back at the end of Black Adam, that didn't seem to generate that much excitement for the future of DC either. To piggyback off the previous point, if Man of Steel turned out to be a much better movie, or if the movie developed Clark much better, do we get a Man of Steel 2 instead of BVS? Is it possible that the reason Warner Brothers wanted to rush a cinematic universe with a bunch of new characters was because they knew audiences didn't love Man of Steel and didn't love Superman? Maybe. I am throwing out a lot of hypotheticals, and you'd be fair to criticize me for that. All I know is that Man of Steel did not end up being what Warner Brothers wanted it to be, and that is why 12 years later we are getting a new Superman. I find it almost comical that most of these shots in the first trailers seem to emphasize that this is not Man of Steel. We have a Superman that is trying to help people. The movie is also really colorful, and Clark seems to care what the world thinks about him. 12 years later, DC has completely abandoned the Man of Steel interpretation of the character, and I think that's going to be the legacy of this film. What do you guys think about Man of Steel? Am I being too harsh calling this movie a failure? Does it deserve to be called a failure? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to hit the Claude Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.